Lizzy Gravelle, thank you for taking the time to be here with me and interviewing for our fourth edition of the CAT newsletter. So would you please go ahead and introduce yourself for our viewers?
My name's Elizabeth Gravelle, but people call me Lizzy. Everyone calls me Lizzy. I'm currently in North County, San Diego, in my parents' house.
Yep.
I teach the history and feminist film theory as it applies to women in horror films, and I currently have 8 students.
All right.
I would say active participants, though, is more like 5.
What was your original kind of motivation to teach, thinking back all the way to the last semester when you put in your proposal?
I kind of want to be a teacher in the future.
Great.
And this is a subject that I care so much about and I love so much, and seeing an opportunity to experiment with starting to learn how to teach, to really feel if I liked it, if it was a thing I felt like I could do. I was really excited, and that being able to experiment that as an undergrad, I was really excited about. It sounded like such a great option, and it sounded like it would be good for my grad school applications. Like there was so much to it that seemed like it would be a very good experience.
Great. And so that kind of answers the next question. What are your teaching goals, or how do you see yourself teaching in the future?
This is, assuming all the paperwork is filed correctly, this is supposed to be my last semester. I'm supposed to be graduating, but I have a hopeful path of grad school and then eventually maybe a PhD. I really want to teach at the college level at some point in this field and on this subject, because I'm really very passionate about it. Well, I started to get into horror films in about my senior year of high school, my freshman year at SF State, because I found there's a lot of things that I really, really loved in film. I loved superhero movies, and I loved science fiction, and I loved fantasy. I loved all these stories. And there's lots of these movies in that genre that have a lot of women in them. But the thing that drew me to horror was just this immense presence of there's so many women, and they're the main characters. And they do things. There's just the overwhelmingly just huge gust of women. And it wasn't always perfect representation. It didn't always have the best sexual politics, but it was just this immense relief to see women existing in this genre as much as they do. And that feminist theory, specifically in film theory, was always what I found most interesting. And talking about sex and gender politics in film, and how films over the years how artists have pushed back against the restraints of Hollywood, how the mainstream film industry has attempted to moralize these things like gender roles and sex in film was always super interesting. So the fact that horror is a genre that already exists so outside from the mainstream to begin with, that's its purpose, it pushed those pre-existing boundaries within the industry more so than any other genre could, in terms of its representation and its working with sex and gender politics.
All right. Wow. So what type of critical lens do you bring to, I guess, your analysis of these films then? What are you trying to expose, or?
And what I try and do right now is really examine, because there's waves of feminist theory and feminist activism, right? There's first, second wave, third, and I feel like we're in a fourth wave right now that is still defining itself. We're in the early days of fourth wave feminism, and I often describe it as very intersectional. And so my personal goals in terms of how I approach the subject is I'm trying to have a very, very intersectional modern interpretation and view on it. And especially in a big thing I'm doing in a lot of my lectures is I'm trying to put into context, this is what films did before, and how does that compare to what we've seen in the last 10 years? Like the last 10, 15 minutes of my lectures really, really focus on the last 10 years of horror. Because again, much like how we're in the early stages of fourth wave feminism, I think that we're in the middle of an era of horror films that we aren't totally going to be able to contextualize until we're out of it. So I think it's interesting to apply the new kind of feminism we're at now and see how is that influencing the kind of horror and the kind of women and queer people that we see in horror now. Like, how are these things interacting?
You are going into the right field because you're obviously passionate about it and you're so knowledgeable about it. So thank you for that. Thinking back a little bit and kind of a little more self-reflexively and maybe a little more generally, how would you describe yourself as a learner? And then how does that kind of help you inform your teaching styles?
I'm a serial procrastinator.
Yeah.
And I have ADHD, so paying attention is really hard for me. So I learn the best when I'm in an environment that forces me to pay attention, even when it comes to subjects I enjoy or am interested in. I work best in very interactive classroom settings. So I'm a big fan of not necessarily splitting up into groups for conversations, but I'm a big fan of like a really open dialogue in classrooms that's participatory and really encouraging of different people to share their thoughts, because I think that's the best way to keep people engaged. Is when they feel like they can, like, you don't want people to just feel like they're listening to you, because it's, for me at least, it's very easy for me to, even if I find what you're saying interesting, it's so easy for me to get distracted and zone out if you're just talking and feeling like it's safe for you to pop in with your take on what's being discussed. I think is the most, for me, the most valuable and effective way that I learn.
What has been exciting about teaching so far, and maybe what's been surprising about your experience?
What's been the most exciting is a lot of, like, honestly, I've gotten to find a whole bunch of new, even more research resources on the subject. So I did a lecture, one of my third lecture was on female werewolves, and that is a super, unlike female vampires, which there's a plethora of writing about, and there's so much, female werewolves are a less seen figure in horror films, so there was a lot less writing about it. So I had to actively search for it, and I found this like fascinating thesis that a woman wrote. I think it was for USC. I might have to double check, but it was, so stuff like that, like finding new writing and even more material on the subject that I already knew existed has been so much fun. I love to learn about this subject, so it's been like, I feel like I've learned more about this through teaching it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're finding other people's like graduate theses and things that aren't necessarily even published yet. So you're on the cutting edge of this field. That's great.
Well, exactly. It's so interesting to see like really, really new material, because the foundational text for a conversation about women in horror is Carol Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which came out in 1993.
Okay.
I love that book. I read it for the first time my freshman year of college, and I fell in love. But it came out in 1993. It was written in 1993. It's been almost 30 years. Yeah. Like a lot has happened in the genre since then, and a lot has changed, largely in response to that book. So it's really, really interesting, and definitely, I think, valuable to be finding all of these newer writing from younger and newer scholars and academics. It's so interesting.
Yeah, that's great. What has been one of your greatest, besides finding all these new materials that you're really interested in, what's been your greatest success or breakthrough with students in the classroom or in the Zoom class?
With my students, I have one student who came in on the very first week. She said, I don't really like horror movies. And I was like, and then she said, that's why I'm here. And I was like, yes. And so the positive feedback I've gotten from her specifically about the films we've screened has been wonderful. And I was so happy to hear that you haven't found I like to say to people sometimes when they tell me they don't like horror, well, everybody likes horror. You just have to find your genre of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not everyone's gonna love slashers, not everyone's gonna love exorcism movies, not everyone's gonna love hauntings, but you might like, people, but a lot of people like, well, I like Silence of the Lambs, or I like or I like Evil Dead. Like, maybe you like comedies, maybe you like psychological horror, but like, you just need to find your horror. So I think my favorite feedback from her was just that, you found these, they were movies I never would have thought to watch, and I really, really liked them, and it made me so happy to hear.
Yeah, you opened that, at least that student and probably many others' perspective on horror. They saw it as one thing, and obviously it's so many subgenres and different things. Yeah.
It's just it's so easy to see as one thing. I think a lot of people hear horror and they immediately think Friday the 13th or Halloween, which are franchises I love, for the record, but are not representative of the entire scope of the whole genre.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, what has been one of your greatest challenges?
Getting things done on the schedule I said I would get stuff done has the absolute hardest part. We're doing our best, though.
Thinking a little larger about kind of your experience at SF State and the SF State community, how would you describe that community, and why has that been so important to your learning experience and also your students?
I think that SF State I like that it's very, I don't know if small is the right word. I like that it's kind of contained. It's kind of like, it's easy to navigate. You find, like, you see the same people around. It's not a huge campus, and there's not 1,000,010 people on campus. So you get, even if people aren't actively your friend, you kind of know most people.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes everything feel very communal, which is interesting because it's a commuter school. So not everybody's living on or even immediately near campus, but it leads to an environment in the departments that makes you tight knit and makes you close, because you have to talk to each other by the nature of everything you're doing, especially in the cinema department, when you have projects and films, when you're getting more into the technical side of it, you have to do things with people.
Yeah. So what you love about your department is that it's so collaborative in a lot of ways, and you do have to work with others and be creative. Yeah, that sounds great. We were chatting a little bit before about some of the kind of ways that you're allowed to customize your major and think about how it's specific to you. Yeah, talk about that one.
I like, there's in the cinema department, at least as I've experienced, there's a huge, it's still pretty white, TBH, but in terms of age and gender and viewpoint, I find it to have a rather diverse set of teachers that I've had. I get a lot of younger people, and so you have older people, older and younger instructors. So you get this huge variety of perspective on film history and theory. And I found that even the teachers who don't have a heavy focus themselves on like a gendered perspective on film history or theory, like I said before, Professor McBride, he's very, very like opening and welcoming to the fact that this is your perspective, and this is the sub-subject that you clearly know a lot about and care about. That means you'll have something interesting and new to say. Like, I appreciate that the department just is so open to a variety of perspectives and letting people like, it encourages, I think, new thought and diverse thought, because nobody expects me to just say what they want me to.
Great. Do you think it's that environment and allowing you to kind of embrace that new thought and diverse thought is contributed in some way to your teaching for ExCo?
I hope so. I try to, because most of my lectures are pre-recorded, but we do meet on Mondays shortly for about half an hour to chat. And I try to not talk too much in those conversations. I very much try and let people like, no, tell me what you think. Tell me if you disagree with something I said in lecture. Like, I want to hear what you have to say. I try very, very much to encourage other people's critical thinking, because at the end of the day, a lot of this conversation is so subjective.
Mm-hmm.
There very few things can be stated as a direct fact, and so how you as an individual interpret the theory or the idea that I have tried to communicate to you is your perspective and your interpretation of what I've said and what you watched is just as valuable as mine. And it's probably different. So
that's great. Really opening the space for people to explore. And it sounds like that was modeled to you by your professors in the cinema department. All right. Well, you know, let's leave it off with any advice that you have for future ExCo teachers, whether they're teaching a film concentrated class or any class.
start early. Get like, especially if you're going to be pre-recording the lectures the way I have been, my biggest advice is to start writing and editing stuff to get as much done early and beforehand as you can.
Got it.
If you go into the semester with a backlog of work already done, it's going to make everything so much easier.
Yeah, especially if you're pre-recording and things like that. Would you take your own advice in the future?
I want to say yes, but
It's a little bit of a trick question.
but knowing myself, probably not.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you, Lizzy, for teaching with ExCo and for bringing such a positive, outlook and persona to our 401 meetings, and yeah, spreading your knowledge through ExCo. I think that's amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for talking to me. I hope that I had valuable things to say. I realize that I stutter quite a lot when I talk and repeat myself quite a bit. So
I didn't pick up on that myself. I think it sounded great.